What is going on, investors? Hopefully, guys are doing well out there. It is time to talk about Advanced Micro Devices, ticker symbol AMD. This comes on the heels of the company reporting their Q1 earnings after the bell. We'll get into them. We'll take a look at just 71% year-over-year revenue growth, up to $5.9 billion. We'll talk about how that beat expectations. We'll also give you a little bit of guidance on the upcoming quarter in the full year for AMD. Now, AMD over the last quarter has actually grown quite a bit by kind of leveraging their balance sheet. We'll show those to you when we get over to the financials. We'll take a look at the revenues, the profits, but when you're doing a lot of acquisitions like AMD has over the last quarter, we'll show it how it's impacted the company from a financial perspective. We'll come over here and take a look at the stock chart as well. This one during the regular session was up about 1.4%. And the after hours, after reporting these earnings, the stock's up another about 4%. Over the last year, the stock's up 16%, but year to date, this one's actually down by about 40%. So even if you've been a little bit late to the party on AMD, I think there's still an opportunity here to make some money, since as we go through these results, I think you'll be rather impressed. Now, speaking of those results, revenue came in at $5.9 billion. That was 71% year-over-year growth. That beat expectations by about $330 million. Now, the all-important upcoming quarters, AMD gave us guidance for the full year. They're expecting revenues to come in at about $26.3 billion. Consensus was much closer to 25.5. That will be year-over-year growth of 60% if and when they hit those targets. This is a very, very fast-growing company, and one of the ways that they're doing that is they're making acquisitions. The Xilinx acquisition in the most recent quarter, that actually closed. When we go over to the financials, we'll show that added like about $800 million to their revenue and profits as well. AMD has also acquired an edge computing startup for about $1.9 billion. I don't believe that deal has closed yet. Now, there was some kind of chatter all quarter that maybe there was some downgrades, maybe there was some softening of demand. When we get over to the revenues, we'll see that's not necessarily the case, or maybe that was overblown a little bit. The other thing that AMD is doing is, man, they're doing some shareholder-friendly stuff. An $8 billion share repurchase authorization. This comes on the heels of a $4 billion buyback that they announced in May of 2021. It looked like they burned through about $3 billion of that. They've added another $8 billion on top, so I believe they have about $9 billion that they can use to buy back shares. Now, in terms of the earnings estimates and revenue estimates, man, Wall Street still believes AMD is going to have their foot on the pedal all year. You've got 40, 50, 70% revenue growth over the next couple quarters to flatten out into 2023. So some of that flattening out of demand might be starting to be priced into the stock a little bit, because when we come over here and look at this from a traditional valuation metric, we've seen the price to sales multiple just completely come in on AMD. Now, it's not rock bottom. It's not necessarily cheap. Certainly, if you compare it to other chip stocks out there, particularly Intel, you're trading at a little over 6 times sales on AMD. But part of the reason why you've got to pay a premium, if they've got 70% year-over-year revenue growth in the quarter, they're projecting 60% year-over-year revenue growth for the full year. So you're going to pay a premium from a valuation perspective when that happens. But this stock earlier this year was trading north of 10 times sales, and it's traded very recently north of 12 times sales. So that multiple has absolutely come back. We'll see evidence of that when we come over here and look at the stock chart. Now, the financials paint an absolutely fantastic picture over at AMD. We see here that margins year over year just up slightly by about 2%, but quarter over quarter, those slipped a little bit. We'll show those to you when we get to the profitability side. Now, on the revenue side, came in at $5.8 billion. I'll show you the Xilinx contribution in this. That's why quarter over quarter, it looks really explosive. You went from 4.8 to 5.8, but keep in mind, in this December quarter, the Xilinx revenue is not baked into that. Now, year over year, going to also paint a glorious picture where you went from 3.5 to 5.8. Look, even without Xilinx, you're still having explosive growth over there, but it's starting to get quite a bit bigger. Now, you called cost of sales on that 5.8 coming in at 2.8. So you get your total cost of sales at about $3 billion in the most recent quarter. That gave you gross profit. So you have this 5.8, you minus a $3 billion off of that. So you have gross profit coming in the most recent quarter at 2.8. A quarter ago, you were at 2.4, and a year ago, you were at 1.5. Now, you had research and development fees really tick up in the most recent year. Notice that those went over $1 billion really for the first time that we have here on record. A quarter ago, you were at just $800 million. Last year, you were at $610. Now, marketing, general, and administrative also went up quite a bit as well year over year, almost double from $319 up to about $600 million. You had to recognize some acquisition-related intangibles. You had to recognize those here on the statement of operations. That came in at $293 million. So our operating income, not particularly impressive over at AMD. You see it knocked down from $1.2 billion down to $951. Again, partly related to the fact that you had a little bit of margin contraction. Also, you have about $300 million in amortization and acquisition-related intangibles that likely, maybe you have another quarter where some of those roll onto the balance sheet. My guess is this is kind of a one-time thing. If you want to add back in this $300 million, you get to a relatively flat kind of quarter-over-quarter operating income perspective. A year ago, you were sitting at 662. I think the thing to really take away from this are these margins. Can they maintain them here? Can we continue to bump those up? Certainly something that investors will be keeping a very close eye on when it comes to this company. You see year over year too, shares outstanding started to go up. Obviously, you make acquisitions, those types of things can be impacted. So you were diluted from a share basis over at AMD, and that could also have created some pressure on the stock as well. Now, in terms of their assets on the balance sheet, it still looks really good. Okay, you have like over almost $6.5 billion sitting on the cash balance side. You've got another 3.6 in receivables. That's up tremendously since December. You're at 2.7 up to almost 3.7 on that receivable side. They have plenty of inventory at nearly $2 billion at the beginning of the year. Now you're up to 2.4. They're doing well there on that balance sheet, especially if they can move through that inventory in the coming quarters. Obviously, they're projecting pretty strong sales growth through the rest of the year. So they clearly have the confidence of that. Now we see some evidence of the acquisitions. You come down here to long-term debt, and that is a brand new number. At nearly $5 billion, you barely had any long-term debt a year ago. So that's definitely been bolstered up. Now, they don't give us a full read on cash flows. They don't break it out. My guess is in the coming days when they actually file the 10Q, you'll get the whole cash flow, which is unfortunate. I kind of wanted to go through cash flows and see how that acquisition worked out. We'll see it maybe in a couple of days. But on the operating side, $995 million worth of positive cash flow. We talked about how their operating profits actually went down quarter over quarter. But again, a lot of that had to do with kind of some acquisition related expenses. You see quarter over quarter cash flows look a little bit better. You went from $822 million up to nearly $1 billion. Last year, you were right at about $900 million. So they're doing a very nice job there. And then from the financing activities, we probably see evidence of that long-term debt that they added to their balance sheet. Now, here's what I also want to show you with the Xilinx revenue in the most recent quarter. It was about $790 million. You can just factor that in. When you look at kind of your year-over-year revenue over at AMD, if you want to strip out the Xilinx revenue, you can strip it out quarter over quarter and year over year as well. But all things being considered, we're seeing over at AMD basically strength across the board, year over year, quarter over quarter. They're seeing growth among all their business segments, and they've added on this Xilinx revenue, which should definitely benefit the company in the longer run. All things look pretty good there from a financial perspective. We'd love those margins to tick up in the most recent quarter, but I guess you can't have it all if you're looking for an investment. Now, this stock from a technical perspective is locked in like these downward channels. We're seeing this in a lot of stocks. I mean, there's a ton of stocks that are setting up in these channels. We're seeing stocks, yes, they have little rallies. Sometimes they last a day or two, or maybe even a week, but then they really flame out really quick, and then the red candles show up, and these things are violently moving down. That's been happening with AMD. You see a ton of red candles in this downward channel. There's a little bit of green every once in a while. Now, the overhead resistance on AMD at the current time is sitting up here at about $98 per share. Currently in the after hours, we're sitting close to about $95 per share on this one. As it walks up to this $9,500 level or so with AMD, plus or minus $4 or $5 on this one, it's going to meet some overhead resistance. It's also going going to meet this lower trend line, which you can draw in a number of different ways. It's kind of in here a couple of different spots, but I would expect AMD to meet some resistance here and then begin a pullback. Now, will it pull back below the previous lows? Right now, you'd have to expect that with the channel that AMD is making on. That would mean that we would come back down here and retest 85. That can potentially be an area where you'd buy this. I see a much lower area of support, which acted as support for a while with AMD from August of 2020 all the way into May of 2021. The stock bottomed down here at about $75 per share. That's certainly an area where I'd be pretty excited about AMD, okay? Certainly from a traditional valuation perspective, it would bring that multiple in even more, give you a little bit of margin for safety just in case these analysts are right and we do have a little bit of softening demand heading into the back half of the year. But more specifically with AMD, we're seeing on that revenue side, we're going to go from like 50-60% growth down to like the mid-teens, like almost overnight in 2023. Again, this is according to analysts. Same thing kind of on that earnings side. We're going to see a flattening of earnings, flattening of revenue. I think investors are starting to digest that now and starting to price AMD not as a company in the most recent quarter. I talked about how we had fantastic revenue growth of 71%. The full year is going to come in at 60, but investors are starting to price this stock in at a mid-teens growth level from that earnings side and that revenue side. Your upside is if AMD can buck that trend and could get into the 20, maybe even 30% range on that revenue side and on that earnings side. That would come well over estimates, and that is what would send this stock higher in the longer term. I believe it's going to be tough for a year out. You're looking at mid-teens growth for this stock to push back to the highs that we saw just a year ago. I just don't necessarily think it's going to happen. That's why I think any shorter term rally with AMD will likely lead to lower prices after you see a little bit of a pullback. I still own this stock. Like I said, it is a top 15 holding for me. I continue to hold. The buybacks and the longer term growth should still be with AMD. That's why I continue to hold these shares. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed today's video. Back in soon with more. Good luck with your investments.